Here's something most gardeners don't realize until they've fought poor soil for years. If you want loose, fertile, living soil, you don't start with the shovel, you start with the earthworms. Worms are not just a bonus, they are the workforce that builds soil structure, cycles nutrients, and keeps roots healthy. If your beds feel lifeless or compacted, it's usually because worms don't have enough food underground. Today, I want to show you exactly what you can bury in your garden or raised beds to attract and keep earthworms working for you year-round, using practical methods that serious gardeners can apply immediately. Why buried organic matter is the fastest way to increase earthworm populations. Earthworms live where food, moisture, and oxygen meet. They are not interested in bare soil or synthetic fertilizers. What draws them in is slow-decaying organic material placed below the surface where it stays moist and protected. When you bury the right materials at the right depth, worms move in, multiply, and begin pulling organic matter deeper into the soil profile. This creates natural channels for air and water, while producing worm castings exactly where plant roots can access them. In raised beds especially, buried food sources prevent the soil from drying out and becoming biologically inactive. Now, let's talk about kitchen scraps that actually feed worms instead of, attracting pests. Vegetable scraps are one of the most reliable ways to feed worms underground when handled correctly. Things like chopped vegetable peels, leafy greens, coffee grounds, and even crushed eggshells break down quickly and are, really easy for worms to process. Always remember to bury scraps 6 to 8 inches deep, never shallow. And importantly, always mix them with at least twice as much soil or dry carbon material by volume. For example, if you bury 1 gallon of kitchen scraps, mix it with 2 gallons of garden soil or shredded leaves before covering. This simple step prevents odor, deters pests, and creates the moist, microbe-rich environment worms absolutely love. A practical approach, actually, is trench feeding. Just dig a narrow trench between rows or along the edge of a bed, place a thin layer of scraps, cover with soil, and water lightly. Then, rotate trench locations every 2 to 3 weeks, so worms spread evenly throughout the bed, rather than clustering in one spot. Aged manure and animal bedding create worm magnets underground. Well-aged manure is honestly one of the strongest worm attractors you can bury, especially if you're working with new or depleted beds. Chicken manure, rabbit manure, goat manure, and cow manure all work well, provided they're composted or aged enough that they no longer smell sharp or hot. It's important to remember that fresh manure can actually repel worms and even damage roots. A safe ratio, I'd say, is 1 part aged manure to 3 parts native soil when you're burying it. Place it, about 8 to 10 inches deep, especially under heavy feeding crops like tomatoes, squash, or brassicas. If you have access to old animal bedding that's mixed with straw or wood shavings, this is honestly even better. The manure provides nitrogen, while the bedding adds carbon, creating a slow-release food source that worms can work on for months. In raised beds, it's best to bury this mix in the lower third of the bed to build long-term fertility. Shredded leaves and paper, they really build long-term worm habitat. Worms don't just eat nitrogen-rich material, they need carbon to balance their diet. Shredded leaves, cardboard, and uncoated paper are ideal materials to bury alongside greener inputs. Leaves, in particular, mimic the forest floor system where earthworms naturally thrive. Before burying, it's a good idea to lightly moisten and shred them so they break down faster. A reliable working ratio is roughly 3 parts shredded leaves to 1 part green material such as kitchen scraps or manure. In practice, this might look like layering. You dig a shallow pit, add about 2 inches of shredded leaves, then 1 inch of green material, and finally cover it all with soil. This layered approach, well, it feeds microbes first, which then feed worms. Over time, you'll notice it creates a sponge-like soil structure that resists compaction and holds moisture. Crop residues and root systems, they feed worms without any extra effort. One of the most overlooked worm feeding strategies is simply leaving roots in the ground. When a crop finishes, just cut the plants at soil level instead of pulling them out. The roots will decay underground, feeding worms and microbes, while leaving channels that improve drainage and aeration. For larger plants, just chop the stems into smaller sections and bury them nearby, rather than removing them from the garden. Compost buried strategically accelerates soil life. Finished compost can be buried, not just spread on top, to jumpstart worm activity in targeted areas. This is especially useful when establishing new raised beds or revitalizing tired sections of the garden. Bury compost in pockets or bands rather than mixing it evenly throughout the soil. Concentrated zones give worms a reason to move in and stay. A simple method is to dig planting holes larger than usual and refill them with a blend of 1 part compost to 2 parts native soil. Over time, worms distribute nutrients outward from these pockets, improving the entire bed. How depth, moisture, and timing determine success. Most worm-feeding materials should be buried between 6 and 10 inches deep. Shallower burial dries out too fast and invites pests, while deeper placement can limit oxygen. Moisture matters just as much as food. After burying materials, water enough to dampen the soil without creating soggy conditions. Consistent moisture keeps worms active and feeding. Timing also plays a role. Fall and early spring are ideal for burying larger amounts of organic matter because cooler temperatures support worm activity and reduce odor issues. In hot climates, smaller, more frequent additions work better. If you want soil that improves every season instead of wearing out, stop treating worms as an accident and start feeding them on purpose. Bury the right materials at the right depth with the right balance, and they will build the soil structure and fertility no bag of fertilizer ever can. If this guide helped you think differently about feeding your soil from the ground up, make sure you subscribe to Evergreen Garden, share this with a fellow gardener, and keep growing smarter, healthier gardens season after season.